Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and here today to debate me on the nature of rights is a libertarian theorist, writer, and patent attorney, Stephan Kinsella. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
So, if we're going to debate rights, I think we have to settle on a definition. And I know you're a stickler for using words meticulously, and that's something I really respect about you. So, how would you go about defining rights? What's a definition that we can agree on?
It's really difficult, to be honest. There's different ways of getting to this issue. So people, like, one common way is to say a right is a claim. Okay, they'll say that. But the problem is that's just another definition by another term, right? The way I think about rights, and this is a little bit legalistic, and there's lots of legal theorists who have various technical, like Wesley Hofeld and Kelsen, these guys, they have different ways of breaking down types of rights and all these things. I think of a right. So first of all, a right is a normative thing. It's not a factual thing. So I do think that we can make a distinction, a conceptual distinction between normative claims and factual claims. And by that, I mean, and maybe some Randians would oppose this dualism or whatever, but I think Hume was right when he made the criticism of many natural law or natural rights arguments that you make an assertion about the world, a factual assertion, and then you just all of a sudden jump to a should statement or an ought statement, which is normative, right? Without recognizing that you need to do some work to justify going from facts to norms, because there's a gulf there, there's a difference. So I think of a right as a type of normative claim. And by normative, I mean like a moral or an ethical claim, something about shoulds and what we should do. And so I think of it as a subset of a broader class of normative claims. And if you just think about morality in general, like a code of morals or ethics, we talk about what we should do, what you shouldn't do, right? What you ought to do, what you ought not do. And either that's implicitly hypothetical because it's based upon a presupposed goal, like if you want to live a good life, then you should do this, or it's categorical in the Kantian sense of you ought to do this because of your nature, something like that, right? So that's how people think about these terms. But the point is, it's a normative thing. It's a prescription, not a description. So if I tell you about the law of gravity or the way you build a road or the way you cook a recipe, it's all in the realm of causality and causal laws. You're describing the way the world is in a factual sense. But if I tell you how you should behave as a human being in a social context, I'm telling you what you should do. You shouldn't be a bad friend. You shouldn't be dishonest. So these norms have to do with prescription. And the other thing to notice is when you say that you should do this, or you shouldn't do this, or we're talking about moral or ethical or normative laws. And when we say law, we mean a rule that says here's how you should act in a certain situation. That's distinct from causal laws, because causal laws are not like choice based. Like, we're not saying that gravity has a choice to be other than what it is, right? We're saying that it just is, and we've noticed this, and we can base our behavior on that. But when you give someone advice about how you should act, you're telling them they should choose A over B, right? So that's why the normative law. So when we talk about a moral law, we mean it's a recommendation as to what you can do, but there's an implicit recognition that you don't have to do it. Like, there's nothing forcing you to do it. So I can't choose to violate the law of gravity. It is a law. It is true. It's a causal law. And if I disregard it, I will just plummet to my death if I walk off of a building and don't recognize that it's real, right? So my agreement with whether the law of gravity is real or not. That's a causal law. is irrelevant because it's going to apply no matter what. But normative laws have this teleological or this choice aspect or this decision aspect. So it's possible for me to violate a law of morality. I can choose to be immoral. I can choose to do something wrong. I can't choose to violate the law of gravity. So that is one distinction between the way we, as human beings, in comprehending the world we live in, which is a blend of the factual and the normative. It's the way we understand our complex social situation, right? So, given that background of how I look at it, I think a right is a certain special type of norm. So there are regular norms like common advice or common wisdom. You should be honest. You should be thrifty. You should be a decent person, whatever. But there's a sort of a subset of this which has to do with interpersonal relations. In fact, a lot of morals are not interpersonal at all, right? Like if Crusoe's alone on a desert island, I would say that morality applies to what he does. Like he should be thrifty, he should be prudent, he shouldn't be lazy, he should prepare for the future, even though he's the only guy that exists, right? None of those are interpersonal norms. But if another person was there, there would be interpersonal norms. You should be polite to your other neighbor. You should be respectful of their I don't know of their existence. You should communicate with them. You should try to trade with them, whatever. Now, so there's a subset of norms that have to do with interpersonal relationships, and a subset of those have to do with rights violations. Okay, so I would say that you can come up with lots of normative conclusions that have to do with how you should treat other people, and these are not axiomatic. These are not deducible from philosophy, but they're things we learn from experience and from living our lives as human beings in our framework. So you shouldn't be disrespectful to your neighbors, and you shouldn't be unnecessarily cruel to your grandmother, like these types of things. These are all moral things you can talk about, and people are going to have practical wisdom and have elaborations and all that. But they're not really about what rights are. So the rights is even a subset of that, and that is the subset of interpersonal relations that have to do with conflict among people. And the conflict arises because we do live in a world of scarcity. And in this world of scarcity, that means that there are means of action, the things Austrian economists, especially like Mises talks about, scarce means of action, including our bodies and scarce physical means in the world, which we always have to use, we all use to accomplish things in the world. And these things lead to the possibility of conflict among men. Okay. And because of the possibility of conflict, those of us that have certain values where we prefer peace, or we prefer cooperation and prosperity and the general the general prosperity of our fellow men in addition to ourselves, because we tend to have these empathetic and feelings, empathy, and which means, to my mind, we value each other to a certain degree, even though it's not as much as ourselves. We still value each other rationally. That's why I believe that we tend to prefer a peaceful solution and a conflict-free solution to a conflict-ridden solution, which is why I believe property rights emerge as the norm. So property rights to me is a subset of the norms about how you deal with other people. It's an interpersonal norm. And now you ask, what is a right? What is a right? So again, some people would say a right is a claim. But to my mind, that's just switching words. It's like, okay, well, it's just a claim. Okay, but then what's a claim? Well, it's a right. You could have a circular definition. My view is this. If we keep in mind that we're talking about the field of teleology and of norms, right? Which means we keep in mind that there's a difference between moral laws and causal laws. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a causal law cannot be violated, but a normative law can be, because it's just a prescription. It's not descriptive of the way reality works. So that's why we have to separate these things. That's why it's possible to do something wrong that violates people's rights. So I think of the more I've read about this from Rand and even some Randian, neo-Randians like Douglas Rasmussen and Douglas Denial in their book like Norms of Liberty, and some others like David Kelly and even some non-objectivists. My view is that the way to look at rights as their meta norms, okay? A meta norm. So a norm is something like Rand would talk about in a code of morality or a guide to conduct. It's what you would consult when you decide what I should do on a day-to-day basis in my life. Okay, so that's what morals are about. Morality is a code of conduct to guide your behavior. Again, it's you can choose it. You can choose to disregard it, but it's still a normative guide to your behavior. If I want to live a good life, I should act this way, whatever. But I think of rights as, so most libertarians would think of the non-aggression principle, for example, as a succinct way of expressing the core libertarian political idea. They would think of that as like a moral stricture, like you shouldn't commit aggression. Now, I happen to believe that you should not commit aggression, but it's not because I think that, but that's just because it's one of the rules you should follow. It's like being honest. You should be honest. You should be hardworking. You should be a good person. You should have integrity, and you shouldn't commit aggression. I agree with that. But that's a personal code of conduct. When we talk about rights, they're claims about what you're entitled to do in response to someone physically acting to invade your space, basically, right? And so what I think when people say that I have a right to X, what they're really saying is, if I were to use force to defend my claim to this space, okay, I can't be coherently criticized. In other words, my proposed use of force to defend this space is justified, which is why it ties into what laws are justified, because a law is just a social recognition of your society, your local, your neighbors, the legal system, that they recognize your claim and they're willing to endorse or support your use of force to defend yourself, right? So ultimately, when we say there's a right, what we're saying is that if the legal system uses force to defend your claimed right, that use of force itself is justified. So this is a complicated way of saying what libertarians often say, something like, it's either ballots or bullets. Like it always comes down to physical force in the end, right? And so when you have a law, what you're saying is that the legal principle that we're proposing, like defending my house or my body from rape or murder or whatever, we're saying that if you were to use force to defend yourself, or if the legal system would do so in your name, that would not be unjustified. And I think that's ultimately the claim. So what you're saying is, the reason I call it a meta norm is because I distinguish between morality and the injustice of the legal system. So, for example, and I think maybe Rand might agree with me on this. I'm not sure. A simplistic view of morality, which most libertarians might have, and I don't mean to be critical by saying simplistic, because it's not. It's an attempt to distinguish between. So most people would say that you shouldn't do drugs. And therefore, they're not opposed to a law outlawing drugs, because to their simplistic linear mind, if it's immoral, it should be made illegal, right? But if you have a kind of a more nuanced view of things, you understand that, well, just because something is immoral doesn't mean it should be illegal, right? That's what the libertarian view is like, okay, doing drugs, being a drug addict might be immoral. It might be harmful to your life, but you're not violating someone's rights. So the government is not justified in outlawing it, right? So that's like a second level. And so when you explain that to your normie person, then you might say, well, that's because morality, or that's because rights violations are a subset of morality. Okay, so that's kind of a first approximation about how you explain to people why everything that's immoral should not be illegal. It's because a rights violation should be illegal, but that's only a subset of immorality. But when you put it that way, the assumption is that every rights violation is immoral, although not everything that's immoral is a rights violation, right? And I actually, my personal view that I've come to adopt over the years is that that's actually slightly incorrect. In other words, it's incorrect to say that everything that's a rights violation is necessarily immoral. And the reason is because I view rights as a metanorm. A metanorm is the view of, as a human being living in society that wants to have a moral view of matters and the way human society should operate, what law would I favor as a justified law? So I would say that we should have a law that says you can't steal from people, okay? But that doesn't, and what that means is that it's justified if the legal system uses force to stop crime or to stop theft. It's justified, which means that if someone is caught being a thief or a rapist or a murderer and they're punished or dealt with in a certain way, that response by the legal system or by the victim using the legal system as its proxy, you can't criticize that as itself an immoral action. Like, it's justified. So to my mind, the ultimate purpose of law, and to think about this, is to think about what's justified. But it doesn't mean that every rights violation is necessarily immoral. And again, it's because when you classify the legal system's response to a crime as justified, what you're saying is it doesn't violate the victim, it doesn't violate the aggressor's rights if force is used against him. But it doesn't necessarily imply that what he did was immoral. So this is why my view is that we have to view rights violations not as a proper subset of immorality, but as its own set, which is mostly overlapping with immorality. So no, I would say that 99% of all rights violations are actually immoral, right? Just like I would say that it's immoral to be a dishonest person in general. But I don't think that it's logically necessarily true. And the reason is because the purpose of morality is to guide man's conduct in his everyday affairs. But the purpose of political ethics is to tell us which legal system is justified. So that norm is aimed at determining which laws are just. It's not aimed at telling us how we should act on a day-to-day basis. So given a legal system, which I think is a just legal system, let's say we have a legal system which outlaws murder and theft and extortion and rape and robbery and all this kind of stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that I am always immoral if I choose to violate someone's rights in that system. It probably is in most cases, but I'm not sure if logically the same thing. So for example, you take the typical example, someone out in the woods and they have a baby with them and their baby's starving and there's a winter storm and they see a cabin and they break into the cabin to steal some food to save their baby's life. Is it necessarily, even if we concede that they're committing an act of trespass because they're committing an act of theft and trespass, is it necessarily immoral? I don't know. I don't think so. I think in some cases you could say that my personal decision ought to be to favor my own life and my kid's life, even at the cost of someone else's rights, and be willing to take the consequences. So that's how I sort of view the interplay between norms and meta-norms and causality, description versus prescription, and rights. So given all this, I guess I would say that a right is a claim as to which laws are justifiable regarding the use of force in such a way that the use of force cannot be coherently criticized. And again, this gets to the justification issue. The reason they can't be criticized is because this is why I'm a proponent of Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation ethics and my own sort of spin on it. It's the idea that if you favor, it's the idea that you be incoherent in proposing a norm that inconsistent with the other norms that you necessarily favor. Or that's the argument. I'm getting a little bit too far afield now. Let me stop now and see where you want to interject.
So going back to 1755, which
Okay.
is in the era where the notion of natural rights was popular. There was Locke was writing at the time. There was stuff stirring up in America here. And Samuel Johnson's dictionary defines a right as a just claim, which is right with what you've said. Or that which justly belongs to me is another definition he gives.
Mm-hmm.
And as I went through various dictionaries, the dictionary of 1806, Webster says something to which one has a just claim, something one that may properly claim is due. Some dictionaries define it as a moral claim. And so that's the definition I would go by. I think that in ethics, as an objectivist, I already accept the fact that the initiation of force is immoral, right? So why the added concept of right if all we need to know is that it's immoral for people to initiate force? And I think that the reason you need the concept of rights is because rights reduce to the situations in which it would be appropriate to use force. So if I have a right to do something, it's saying if somebody tries to stop me from doing this, I have the right to use force. It will be moral for me to use force in response.
Yes.
So we agree on all that. The problem I have with the formulation or the sort of description you gave is if you accept Hume's is-ought gap, or if you accept the fact-value distinction, then there is no objective morality. Morality is not something to be discovered in that case, and neither are rights. There's something to be created, in which case there's no objective basis for them. They're just an artifice created by the state, which I don't hold, and I don't believe that you do either. Now, I personally, and I think it's rational, is that if we accept it, as I do, I accept Ayn Rand's theory of rights or theory of morality, that morality is a code of values or that guides people's decisions. It guides your normal behavior. And it's true. It's if you decide to live, if you're not just going to throw yourself off a cliff, then you need some way to guide your behavior, because human beings are not born with knowledge of how to behave. We have to use our rational minds to discover those things and then choose by free will to pursue them. And the guidance that we get in order to do that successfully is called ethics. Now, it's simply a fact that certain things are causally bad for me and certain things are causally good for me, and those things that are causally good for me, I would say those are moral, and the things that are bad, I would say are
Mhm.
immoral. Now, given that, we go through a long chain, and I think you're going to agree, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, that initiating force is evil for me to do. I can't do that. And I have to say, okay, well, in what situations is force appropriate? What do I have a moral claim
Mhm.
to? And I would
Mhm.
say I have the moral claim to freedom of thought, freedom of action, so
Mhm.
long as I don't
Mhm.
initiate force to prevent
Yep.
somebody else from doing the same thing. And I need to have that freedom of action because to the degree that I'm not free, my choices aren't in the realm of morality. It's if you pick me up and carry me from point A to point
Mhm.
B, and I'm completely deprived of choice, there's no moral implications to what I
Mhm.
do. So to the degree there's force, morality doesn't apply. So I must therefore have a moral claim to that which makes morality possible. My rational faculty, freedom of thought and action, which can be boiled down to the concept of human life. I must have the right to life. Now, I know you've argued previously that to say I have a right to life might create a presumption that somebody else has to provide me with
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
necessities to keep my life going. But that only happens if we sever what a right actually is. It's a moral claim. So if it's a moral claim, it has to be based on a sound view of morality, and that would by necessity rule out somebody else having to provide me with the things that are going to keep me alive.
That that's fine, and I think I was with you until about 90 seconds ago. Um, I think if you already accept the social context and the nature of rights that have developed that we basically agree on, although people like you and I are more consistent about how we. I mean, I think your average person roughly agrees even with that, right? They roughly agree you have the right not to be raped and murdered and killed, which
Yeah, they
implies,
just wouldn't agree with the implications, right? They
well,
wouldn't, they don't understand taxation is therefore wrong because it's
correct, but
aggression.
they agree in principle that you have a property right in your body. They just are not fully consistent about it, right? So, but they basically agree. You and I are just way more consistent about it. Um, but to then start describing this right, which I would say is a right to the bodily integrity, like to your bodily integrity, like it's a property right in the control, literally, of the physical integrity of your body, which is what's implied by Ayn Rand when she talks about in Galt's speech when Galt says, "Do you hear me? No one may start or initiate the
Right.
use of force." Like this concept of force is integral to her concept here, and it's because she's recognizing, as she said, men are not ghosts. We're physical material beings, and the way you violate rights is by using physical force. And the reason our rights are bound up with this is because our rights are inherently material in the sense of, I mean, you can't violate. This is why we don't agree with hate speech laws, right? You can't violate my rights by insulting me, only by hitting me. That's what Jefferson said, right? Um, Someone
Right.
who takes my taper or what? I mean, you can't. You could say what you want to someone, but you can't physically invade their borders. And so I think that's why rights have this contour. So if you then start describing that right instead of as a right to my bodily integrity, and you say, well, I just mean that you have a right to life. Well, and then you can be careful as you want and say, well, of course, I don't mean that you have a right to have someone pay for your life because there's no positive obligations. Well, then what's the point of describing it as a right to life in the first place instead of just saying everyone has the right to the physical integrity of their own body? What does it add to say a right to life?
Well, here's the problem. You said correctly that Ayn Rand says that men are not ghosts, but she also is what the exact, not the exact quote, but the formulation she says is that a mind without a body is a ghost, and a body without a mind is a corpse. So you have both. Human
Totally,
life, it consists
totally
of
agree.
both. It
Totally agree.
consists, yeah, mind and matter. So to say that I have a right to life, it means that I have the right to take the actions necessary in order to keep my life going. The reason it's, in my view, necessary is because life is the standard, human life rather, is the standard of morality, right? So because human life is the standard of morality, I have to have a moral claim or a just claim to that which makes morality possible. It isn't just a physical body that makes morality possible. It's mind and body in the specific nature of the
Yeah.
human
Okay.
rational
Okay. But
faculty that makes it
I,
possible.
I hear you, but what does it mean to have a moral claim to that which?
In practice, what it means is that if somebody tries to interfere with my use of that by using force, that I have the right to retaliation. Now, the problem I have with the self-ownership concept, and it's not that I have a problem with self-ownership per se. I have a problem with it being the fundamental starting point, because unless ownership is a human convention, it has to belong to some antecedent concept. It has to be, it's a moral claim you're making. Like, for instance, Rothbard and Hoppe both say that you have this, I think they said there's three choices. Correct me if I'm wrong. I can only think of two, but you could probably think of the others. They said either a person owns him or herself, everybody owns everybody, or everybody else owns this person.
Yeah, something like that.
But what they leave out, those aren't the only possibilities. The possibility is there's no such thing as ownership. Ownership is not a thing to be discovered. You have to prove that. You can't just do it in a rationalistic way, assert ownership is a thing, and then say somebody owns something. You have to prove ownership. You have to prove property rights. But in order to prove property rights, you have to prove that rights are actually a thing to be discovered, not created. Because if they are a thing to be then just created, then we have no
Yeah.
beef with people who are articulating positive rights. The positivists win the
I,
day.
I hear you, but I think what happens is I think that the objectivist view um, wants to integrate everything so much that they so a big part of I think were you not talking about Chris Schiavara the other day?
Yeah, we
One of
did
my
on
buddies.
Twitter. We talked about him.
So he talks about like a big part of Ayn Rand's philosophy is exploding is it exploding dichotomies or something like that? It's like trying to show there's false dichotomies, like the is-ought dichotomy, the mind-body dichotomy, and that's really useful in a sense. But there's almost this obsession with objectivism, with avoiding like the Misesian way, that the Misesian way of a dualistic way of looking at, like, listen, when we're talking about economics, we're talking about explaining um, human behavior, which he calls teleology, right? Which is like in the context of human action, which is purpose oriented, where every human being has means at his disposal, free choice, things he can use, and he tries to employ these means to achieve an end in the future for some psychic profit, and either he's successful or he's not. Like, so the whole structure of human action from Mises is about action with a purpose, guided by choice, contrasted with the causal realm of the sciences, which studies causality, and there's a strict separation there. And I think that's actually makes sense, because when I talk about the laws of physics, I'm talking in the causal realm. When I talk about human behavior, motivation, psychology, norms, prescriptions, not descriptions, we're talking about purpose, and human choice. And like, there's something about that dichotomy that bothers the objectivists, because they want everything to be integrated into a grand unified theory. which is they want to blend it, which is why I think, for example, that they in the rights theory of Rand, which part of her rights theory I agree with, like the intuition that there's got to be a reciprocity in rights, or a symmetry in rights, where she recognizes that the only real way to violate rights is by physical force. But you see, that's sort of a causal thing. That's sort of a materialistic thing. I mean, you can talk about a right to life and man's spirit and his mind, and that's all fine as a conceptual matter. But in the end, you can only physically affect someone's life by using physical force against their physical body. Like if I put you in prison in a
Sure.
concentration camp, I'm imprisoning your body, and your mind is trapped inside there. But unless I have the ability to use physical force against you, I can't imprison your mind. I can't make
No,
you,
I wouldn't disagree with that, but neither would Ayn Rand. But
I
the
agree. She
distinction,
would.
but the distinction you're talking about that Mises makes is between inanimate matter and living beings that act with purpose.
I agree.
And Rand says that that's the very basis for values is that there is a distinction between living entities in inanimate matter, that
Yes.
life faces the constant alternative of
Yes.
existence and non-existence.
Yes.
So she doesn't obliterate that dichotomy. What she says is that there's no mind-body dichotomy, neither can exist without the other as a
Yes.
human. Now, obviously, a
Yes.
body, a corpse can't exist, but it
Yes.
can't exist as a human being. She
Yes.
says that if a theory doesn't work in practice, it's
Yes.
not a good theory.
Yes.
And she says that there is no is ought distinction. The problem here is, well, first of all, I agree with her, but I think that's an argument to be made ethically. But if there is a distinction between is and ought, if morality is a fiction as Hume thought, then you cannot ever arrive at the concept of rights as something to be discovered. You, of
Okay.
course, can legislate it, but you can't.
Well,
It's not real. It's just something created. It's
I
a,
agree
it's
with you.
it's what
I agree with you up to a certain point. I mean, there's no dichotomy, but I don't agree with her that so it doesn't mean there's no distinction between is and ought. Just like I think she would agree, or at least I would agree,
well, it's a
there's no
gap. It's not a distinction. It's a gap because
right.
the two are different.
But that's the
She doesn't
point.
say that.
But
But
so when she distinguishes between the human personality or the mind and the brain, she's correct. The brain and the mind, the corpse, the body and the corpse are different than the human person,
yeah,
right? A dead body has no mind and has no personality. Um, and it's impossible to conceive of a living human being without a body. So, like, they are distinct concepts. It's like the brain and the mind are different concepts. And likewise, I think that um, human action and human behavior are different concepts. Human behavior is a causal explanation of what we witness in the world going on according to the four laws of physics. Which is why, by the way, I actually I personally um, I disagree with free will in the standard sense. There is no such thing as free will because it does violate causality, in my view. However, that doesn't mean there's no such thing as choice, because choice is just the way that we describe the human action from the teleological standpoint. But the only way to get to this point is to have a dualistic, uh, a different way of describing what people are doing. Are you talking about what they're doing in the causal realm, or are you talking about their motivations and their purposes and their actions, right? And so I do believe that it's meaningful to talk about normative claims and rights. And I do, and even earlier, you sort of, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and you can interject, but you sort of said that you understand what I think I meant when I said that Rand's ethics is hypothetical in the sense of it's based upon the choice to live. And
Well, I
even
would say conditional. We're saying the same thing, just using it. I just don't think hypothetical is the proper word. It's conditional. It's if you want to live, then you have to do
that's fine.
this.
And
It's
Roger
morality.
Long is sort of Roger Long is a neo-Aristotelian philosopher. He calls that what he calls it an assertoric hypothetical, which is interesting. It's by assertoric, I think he means that it's not an if then, it's a since then. It's like since you evidently agree that you want to live your life, then you should do the following. And by the way, I don't think this is a problem for Rand's philosophy at all. I think the problem is when earlier you intimated that you're afraid that if you go down this rabbit hole, that it means that there's no objective morality or no objective
No, I'm not afraid of it. Reality is
okay,
reality. I'm not afraid of
okay.
it. I just think it's
I don't mean to
wrong.
say that, but I mean, but your criticism is that there's no objective basis for law or morality and that kind of stuff. And I don't think that's actually correct. I think that if you accept the fact that morality is necessarily okay, you don't like the word hypothetical. I don't know, you could call it conditional if you want to call it, but it's based upon the choice to live. Let's just say that, okay? And if you have the choice to live and you're a rational human being, it's not too hard to figure out the kind of rudimentary basics of the nature of human existence, which means we're social creatures, we have empathy, we have a short lifespan,
Sure.
we live in a world of scarcity. It's better to cooperate than to fight, that kind of stuff. Basics of economics, supply and demand. Once you understand that, it's not too hard to figure out that if you take all those things together, and if you value life over death, and by life I do mean the Randian Aristotelian view of living life as a man, not just living life to survive. I mean, living life proper to your nature as a man. I agree with all that. And I do think that all that implies that there are certain basic principles we ought to apply in our personal moral code, but also in our political code, our laws, right? The proper way for humans to get along and the laws we ought to have. But it doesn't mean that this morality that you get from this is problematic because it's not absolute in some sense. Nothing is absolute. I
It's
mean,
not intrinsic, right? That's what you're talking about. It's not.
no,
It's
what I
not.
mean, no, that's a whole different. What I mean is this idea that people say that it's like they're worried. It's almost like the Christian. It's almost like the Christian concern that if you don't have God, then everything is up for grabs, right? It's
Mhm.
almost like the objectivists have a similar fear because they're worried that if you don't have objective morality, then everything is up for grabs. But to my mind, objective morality simply means that we can come together and figure out the best way that humans ought to live in their own lives and live together. But you have to make some assumptions. Like you have to assume that we're not fellow fucking sociopaths and we're not
Well,
misanthropes.
but Stefan, even when you say best, right? That's a normative concept.
I
If you
totally agree.
said so, if you say humans don't have free will, if you don't have free will, there can be morality is completely dependent on freedom of the will. If you're necessitated to make the decisions you make, then there's no moral implication at all, any more than there is for my computer screen. It works the way it works, and that's
I
it.
mean, I don't know if that's a whole. I, I don't agree with what you just said because I think that like I said something a little bit too cute maybe and too quick, but I said that I believe in choice, but not free will. But
Are you
that's
talking
because
about the libertarian free will where there's no causal factors involved? You don't believe in that? Because I don't either. I mean, I suppose it's important to
no, it's
explain
it's
what you
more of a
mean.
it's more of a the free will debate is the way it's normally framed is something like this. Um, do we have free will or do we not have free will? Um, and then the arguments get embroiled in this oh, what about if you have bad parents? Like they talk about macro phenomena. To my mind, free will had nothing to do with macro phenomena. It has to do with microscopic phenomena on the level of quarks and neutrons and that level of stuff. And but when you're thinking like this, you're thinking in the realm of causality. And as far as we know, there are four laws of physics, and we already know what they are. There are four laws of physics. And that's what governs the interaction of the particles that make us up. But when we think of ourselves as human actors, this is why I said Misesian dualism matters, because it distinguishes between behavior and action. Behavior is a causal phenomena. Action is teleological in the sense of when you describe what the macroscopic object is doing, meaning your body or my body, you're characterizing it in terms of purposes and the use of scarce means. And when you do that, you're thinking of these people as being similar to you, which is how you conceive of yourself, right? As having choices before you, right? And priorities and preferences. And this is a little bit far afield, but I think that there is actually a solution to the free will dilemma. And I think everyone I've ever read, everyone, I mean literally everyone, I'm dissatisfied with everyone's approach because they always get it wrong. The physicists get it wrong. The psychologists get it wrong. The Randians get it wrong. Because the Randian argument is this stupid proof by contradiction, which is we can prove there's free will because if you didn't have free will, then you wouldn't have the choice to reject the argument for or con. And so there, but that's not.
Well, no, but that's not a proof of free will. That's not offered as a proof of free will.
Well, but okay, what is it offered for?
What it's a distinction that they make between validation and proof. What it's saying is that free will is axiomatic. That in order to nothing to say prove you have free will, you can't prove something unless you have free will. The very concept of proof is dependent on antecedent factors.
Right. So first of all, the Randians use the word axiomatic in an idiosyncratic way, but let's let that pass. I mean,
why? Wait, why? What do you mean idiosyncratic?
Well,
self-evident from observation. I don't know. How is that?
Well, I mean, in math, for example, the word axiom is used to refer to an arbitrary assumption that you build on. It's not something you prove by
No, but what about in philosophy?
Well, the basic axioms that Rand talks about, okay? Well, here's an example. A lot of Randians in the early days, because Rand was the first libertarian, I believe, they talk about the non-aggression axiom. It's not an axiom.
Do. No, libertarians some do, and they're mistaken. It's
but
not
now we tend to call it a principle because I think we've learned that it's slightly erroneous to refer to the non-aggression principle as an axiom. It's not an axiom.
No, it's very erroneous to assert it's an axiom.
I agree.
Non-aggression.
And there are some basic truths of philosophy that the Randians rely on, which I agree with all of them, by the way. The law of identity, the law of non-contradiction. They're axiomatic in the sense that to deny their self-evidence and their being essential to reasoning would lead you to self-contradiction. I agree with that. Okay.
Well, let me just read to you I Googled define axiom philosophically. It says to be immediately evident propositions foundational and common to many fields of investigation and self-evidently true without any further argument or proof. I don't know how you're saying she uses axioms in a idiosyncratic way.
I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong with that.
Fair enough.
But to that extent, I agree with her axioms, whether or not the word is properly, I don't know. But I agree with her basic axioms. Okay. The problem is this is exactly how Mises reasons too, with praxeology, with humans act and things like this. But the problem I have is, and then she fights it because
Mises is different though.
It's different, but
it's not the same.
It's not the same, but it's the same method of showing something that is indisputably true. He calls it apodictically true. But the reason is, I think she's so hostile to, oh, it's Kantian, that's Kantian. Like, to my mind, I don't care what terminology or framework you want to use. If it's a reasonable thing you can arrive at, and we can be certain about this belief, that's good enough to move forward. And we can haggle about the way we talk about it. But to get back to the free will thing, the problem, to my mind, is a subtle one of the free will argument. And the argument is that it's not of the same character. So I think you could argue that any human being, excuse me, who lives and exists, who says that there's no such thing as existence, right? They're contradicting this. Or if you say there's no such thing as knowledge, even if you do that,
you're making a knowledge claim.
You're contradicting yourself, because you have to be engaged in, right. So these are the type of things you can say that are, and by the way, this is what Hopper relies upon in his argumentation of things. It's called performative contradictions. There's lots of things like that which you can use in a clever way to show that, look, this is obviously a true claim, because if you attempt to fight it, you're assuming what you're saying is not true, right? And I think that that's the attempt that's made by Nathaniel Branden and Rand and Rothbard, I believe, and some libertarians when they argue for free will. What they say is that, well, we have to have free will because when we have a debate about this, people come up with arguments, and either you have the free will or the choice to evaluate that claim, or you don't. But they're not really pointing to a contradiction in the idea that there's not free will. Like, if I say that Stephan Kinsella exists, but there's no universe, well, I'm contradicting myself, because I have to exist, and also I'm aware of something outside of myself, like, so I can't deny there's consciousness. It's a contradictory assertion. But if I say it's possible that we live in a world where we are totally causally determined, there's no contradiction there, because it's possible that we evolved according to the laws of natural selection, and we end up arguing like this on Facebook and thinking we believe these things and we prove something. But there's no logical contradiction in the fact that we're just wrong, right? I mean, it's possible that we are mechanistic beings.
But that's the whole point, Stephan, is that if you try to argue for knowledge, which is dependent on freedom of the will, but you're arguing against freedom of the will, that's the contradiction. Now it's true on a meta level, on a sort of macro level, that all of that hypothetically could be determined, right? We're made to do this.
Exactly.
Right. But that still renders the statements of the determinist nonsensical.
Well, I don't disagree, but notice what you. So here's to my mind.
It's not a proof of free will. That's not a proof.
I'm not a philosopher, by the way. I could be wrong about this. Okay, but the problem is I haven't been satisfied with anyone I've ever read on this, and I've read a lot. I think the problem is what you just argued is you're trying to come up with an argument for why you can't say something. You're not trying to come up with an argument for why it's not true. So
no, why it's incoherent, not you, because you can say it. I'm saying it's an incoherent statement.
Yeah.
It doesn't, you're right. It doesn't mean in the broad scheme of things, it does mean that the person that's uttering it is not making a coherent statement. But the Randian idea of free will isn't completely dependent on that. She talks about that it's self-evident from introspection, from observation. You can
that's another, but that's another issue. Let me give you one thought experiment. Just see what you think about this.
Okay.
Imagine, and I hate these thought experiments because I don't believe in. I don't think we're living in a simulation, or that's even possible. But sometimes we have to like play with our fancy. Imagine that there's some demigod that is running our universe as his little plaything, right? Let's imagine we are a simulation.
So like Descartes' demon.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Descartes' demon is running our universe, and maybe he's got a god above him. I don't know. But anyway, the point is he's doing this for his own amusement or whatever. He's letting the experiment go wild. Maybe he's a deist. I don't know. in that universe, there's four laws of physics, the four laws of physics that we know, and that in a causal level completely determines everything that we do. Or maybe what we do has a degree of randomness. Maybe there's quantum indeterminacy. But the point is, what these little quark clouds do that constitute our bodies is not, it's either determined or it's just random. It's one way or the other. You could still have these natural selection processes have ultimately rational beings emerge that think and argue and even have the experiential experience that they're experiencing this stuff, and they could just simply be wrong, right? They could simply be wrong. It's my point is that world is conceivable. However, it's not conceivable to have a world of this daemon which has people which are wrong in thinking that they exist. They cannot be wrong about that, but they could be wrong about being part of a fake universe. Like one is possible, one is not. And that's why I think that the proof by contradictions are not the same. But again, I'm not a philosopher, so I can't. That's about the edge of my theory. But my point is, so I think that the Misesian approach is the right way out of this, because Mises talks about a causal realm of phenomena, the causal world, and the realm of teleology or human action or purpose. And when Rand talks about, so you said something like Rand can prove we have volition because of.
No, I didn't say it. No, if I said proof, I used the wrong word.
No, I'm not trying. I'm not. But what did
No,
you?
No, but she would.
Tell me what
She
you're.
would.
Yeah.
She would say, "I believe," and I really, I don't. To be honest, I like to argue for myself and not for
That's fine. That's
for
fine. Tell me
Rand.
what you think.
But I'm okay. But I mean, but it's all right. It's my view of free will is this: is first of all, any claims of determinism are incoherent. You're right. That doesn't prove that determinism is false, but it does send up a skepticism on my part of the person making the claim, because he's assuming that he's free to choose an act while he's denying it to everybody else. He's free to weigh the evidence, to look at the various proofs, to study, unless the conclusion is forced on him, in which case I wouldn't accept it anyway. So I do think that that has its place. But I also think that when I look at myself and I look inside my own mind, I can tell the difference between things I'm compelled to do and things that I choose to do. Like if
Yeah.
somebody pushes me down, I'm being forced to the ground, or if somebody carries me, or, for instance, when I finally fall asleep when I'm utterly exhausted, I have no choice in that. I do have a choice, though, to walk from here to there. So I can make that distinction. So what I would say is that if somebody is going to postulate or argue for determinism, the onus is on them, because all of my experience indicates to me that I'm making choices.
Yeah, I hear you.
And that I'm ultimately free to make these choices.
No,
But
I hear you.
the key relevance to the discussion that we're having about rights, it's like, even you say, like, okay, your own estoppel theory of rights, where you say that a criminal, for instance, is stopped from making the argument that it's unjust to punish him because he's already used aggression, right? But why is it wrong to contradict himself? Or Hoppe's argumentation ethics, okay, he has a performative contradiction. So what? Why is that wrong? You would necessarily have to tie that to a broader theory of ethics in order to say that contradictions are wrong. Not that they're wrong in the sense that two contradictions can't both be true, because two contradictions can both be false. What you have to show is that contradicting oneself in that way is ethically wrong, and that requires a broader theory. And when we talk about rights in the sense that you and I are using the term of natural rights, they're necessarily contingent on ethics. It's a moral claim. You need to have a theory of morality. And if Hume is right that there is no morality, that you can't arrive at an ought from an is, there can be no rights. And then you end up where Mises is at, or where Jeremy Bentham was at, or John Stuart Mill, and you end up a utilitarian in essence, or a nihilist.
Yeah, but again, see, this is this objectivist attempt to unify everything. And so when you say there can be no morality or there no rights, it's like you you want to envision rights as existing in some sense. Almost
Yes.
the same.
Yeah, it's not that I want to. I would argue they do. My argument is that if they don't, if there's no morality, then to say that you have a right to this doesn't mean anything
Well,
outside than somebody says you have a right to it.
well, to be precise, I mean, I'm not saying there's not any morality. I'm saying, I mean, but it's almost a mystical thing when you say there is a morality. Like there's this kind of subdomain or overlayer of space where the morals kind of interject themselves into reality in some kind of known way. I mean, to my mind, earlier we talked about what it means to say there's a right or even a moral claim, and to my mind, it's just a justified claim. Okay, I never said they exist. I was
But
careful.
justified, but the claim, in order for it to be a moral claim, you're saying the moral claim, the right exists.
No, I'm not.
But well,
I would actually,
then the statement.
I'm averse to using the word exist in this sense.
So rights in your view do not exist.
It's like saying, do numbers exist? I mean, I hate to be Bill Clinton, but you have to tell me what you mean by exist.
What I mean is this, is that that rights are something to be discovered, not created. And they're to be discovered based
I
on
agree with that. I agree
okay.
with that.
And I cannot discover something that doesn't exist. That's an
Yeah,
incoherent
but
statement.
that's
Now
playing with
I
language.
want to just address something real quickly that you said
Yeah.
about because I do not believe that morality is something that's out there. I think that morality is strictly grounded in human nature. Human nature, as we have a rational faculty and we have to discover what is best for us, and we have to choose to do so because we face the constant alternative of life and death. There's things in the environment that can harm me. There's things that are good for me. That's all I mean by morality. There's nothing mystical about it. And
And I agree. By the
right?
way, I agree with all that. I
Yeah,
agree with all
yeah.
that.
And but because of that,
But
I
I
then
wouldn't say
have
morality exists. And like, I wouldn't say that these ethical principles exist. Like, to me, that's a loaded phrase to say they exist. What does that mean to say they
what it means. All it means is that these things are true. If I say, for instance, that human behavior ultimately, my long-term survival, it's dependent on principles. I have to think, I have to discover what is going to be best for me tomorrow, the next day, 100 years from now. I can't say, well, because heroin feels real good, let me go out and do it. And that's in my interest because that's going to undercut my long-term interest. I need to discover the principles of survival long-term. When I say those principles exist, it's just saying that certain actions exist that are more likely, a certain type of action exists that are more likely to bring about a certain result. They
and I
won't
agree. And I agree with
that's
you.
all it means to say they exist. And
Yeah,
to
but it's
say that
not. But it's not because the word exist is it's sort of like saying it's one of these words that's fraught with equivocation. I mean, look, I have a friend who believes in objective evil and Jesus and all this stuff, and he thinks that you cannot have epistemology and ethics without Jesus, right, or without God or whatever. But part of his argument is that if you don't accept this, then everything is subjective and arbitrary, and there's no absolute evil. So the example he always gives me is, Stephan, we both agree that it's wrong to have, I don't know, child murder, right? Or child rape. Have some guy kidnap a 5-year-old girl and rape and kill her. And we both agree on that. But then he says, but is that objectively evil? Like he wants to nail it down with the word objectively evil, which I think he means intrinsically evil or something.
I
Like
think
it,
that what he means is that people like that, in my experience, anyways, what they mean by morality is it necessitates there being some force out there that is
I
sort of
agree.
judging our
I
behavior.
agree. I
But
totally agree.
yeah, and that there's true. There are ethical theories that rely on that, but that doesn't preempt the field.
No,
That
no, it doesn't.
doesn't,
It doesn't. It
no,
doesn't.
you know what I mean?
But this is my concern with this. So the concern is, and I think that here's the concern. and you hit the nail on the head in a sense, because something I've written about a little bit is there's something that really bothers me, and I call it um it's a form of legal positivism. Like, legal positivism is this mentality that, okay, in the legal field, it's this mentality that there is no objective law. The only way we can know what the law is and what the law ought to be is from the will of the, excuse me, of the sovereign, which is
Right.
the legislature, according to them, right? Of course, they're totally hypocritical and inconsistent, because the average person that believes like this, because they're kind of moral relativists, they
Right.
won't admit to any external standard of objectivity. However, they will also then say, um, the Constitution does provide for a right to abortion, and if you vote this way, you're wrong. So, but what they really mean is it's inconsistent with their values. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
like, it always comes down to what your true underlying values are, right? And so, to my mind, if I say, and if you say, and if my friend says, um, that guy deserves to hang for raping this little girl, and he says it's objectively evil, and if you don't call it objectively evil, there's something deficient in your theory. To my mind, the problem with his view is that he needs an external authority. Now,
Right.
he's not a legal positivist in the sense of relying on the state, but he
Mhm.
moves it up a level to God.
Right.
So now it's God. So God is the one who says it's wrong. But to my mind, that's nothing more than another command from another sovereign, right?
Yes.
You and
It's
I,
arbitrary.
are, as
Absolutely.
atheists, we would say, no, it's got to be reason or something like that.
Hmm.
And what I think is, Rand is right. Living as a human is a practical affair in the world. We have a certain nature, and there are better and worse ways to live as a man. To me, that's an important qualifier, to live as a man, which is why her standard of, if you choose to live as a man, choosing to live as opposed to dying, those two choices have implications. If you choose to live as a man, then you should follow the dictates of our nature to live a good life within those confines. But, and within those confines, you and I can share values, because we're both people that want to live and live as men, and we share values, and we can push to the side the sociopaths who are not part of our community. And I don't care if they don't agree that it's wrong to rape a 3-year-old girl.
No, it doesn't matter. It is wrong.
Because you can't deal with them with the region anyway. We don't have
No.
anything in common with them. You have to
No.
treat them as
Sure.
a threat and deal with them the way the legal system permits, right?
I think it was Don Watkins. If I'm wrong, my apologies to Don Watkins, but his book, Ethical Ego,
Say
Don
again?
Watkins, Don
Oh, right.
Watkins is right. So I think it's in his book, Ethical Egoism. I'm pretty sure. And what he talks about is that the biggest mistake that objectivists make, and I made this myself early on, is to have a view of ethics where there's some outside force that's kind
Yeah,
of judging you, and it's ethical because
yeah,
when being ethical, all that it's saying is this is either good or bad for my long-term life.
yeah. Totally
Uh,
agree.
th- And that's it. But I understand, I guess what I'm trying to say is your concerns, because a lot of people do think of ethics or morality in the sense of there has to be this mystical
Yeah,
idea behind it.
yeah,
And so when they say objective, what they actually mean is subjective, because it's a mystical lawgiver or just somebody else's
yeah,
mind. It's like what Plato said about where he talked about the horns of, I'm going to butcher the name, but you're a Phthro or whatever it is, where he asked the question, does God love good actions because they're good, or are they good because God
right,
loves them? And
right,
in the one case, you don't need God because they're
right,
already good. And in the
right.
other case, they're completely arbitrary. All right, Stefan, I've kept you
Wait,
long. Go
one
ahead.
more thing on before you start on your point,
Sure.
your final point. This assumption that we should do things that are in our own self-interest, right? The additional assumption from Rand, which I think is correct, is that the assumption that also there's no necessarily internal conflict of interest between men. Like, in other words, we can
Between
live,
rational men.
we can all live together with following our own rational self-interest. And there's no necessary inherent conflict between our rational self-interest. I think that's an extremely important point, because if that wasn't true, then you would just be some weird hedonist, or not hedonist, but some guy that's like totally only cares about yourself.
Yeah, a
right?
sociopath or a narcissist, a sociopath.
Yeah, you'd be a
Right,
total
I agree.
sociopath. But the point is, if you recognize that there is a compatibility among men, then you have an extra reason to factor their interests and their well-being and their rights into your value, I mean, and I think this is all great. This is a good thing about human life, is I think that's the way that this is possible. It is possible for us to live together in peace among each other.
In
It's a good
harmony,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. Go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt.
No, I was just going to say, you told me you wanted an hour and a half. We're about there. It's been a great discussion. I really appreciate you being here to have it with me. Can you tell people where they can find you?
Oh, StephanKinsella.com, and a lot of the stuff we talked. Well, actually, we talked about other stuff today, but my book here, they can find it online, and it's free online.
It is
No
free
copyright.
because I've been reading it in preparation for this discussion.
Yeah, we'll do another episode later, but take care.
Absolutely.
Michael.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for now. This is the Rational Egoist signing out. Till next time.
Thanks.